Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Tzadik Zayin Amud Aleph, 6 lines from the top. The Gemara is speaking about a klal, a principle for when a person is makdish a korban Pesach and he cannot be makriv that korban Pesach. Says the Gemara, Omar Shmuel. Shmuel makes the following statement: Kol shebechatos meso ba Pesach korev shlomim. Here, Shmuel tells us that there are 5 different types of a korban chatos that are left to die. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says the following: Dibra Maschil Omar Shmuel. Says Rashi, Kol shebechatos meso, chamesh chatos mesos, halach l'moshe Sinai. Halach l'moshe Sinai tells us there are 5 different scenarios where a korban chatos is left to die. Kinson the kippah v'hein mesos. They put them inside of a small area without feeding them, and they're left to die. Vlad chatas is the first one. When a female chatas has an offspring, that is one of the first that are left to die. Utmuras chatos. If a person takes a korban, he takes a behemas chulin and he makes a tmura with the chatos. So that animal that was chulin that now becomes a chatas, has the same kedusha of chatas, is also left to die. A third example, third case, is v'chatos shemesu ba'aleho, where the owner of the chatos, he died before bringing his korban chatos. The fourth, v'chatos sheniskapru ba'aleho al yidei ha'acheres she'ov the zois v'achakra nimtzeis. Here you have where he lost his korban chatos. He then was makdish another korban chatos and was makriv that korban chatos. Subsequently, they found the original korban chatos that also has to be left to die. And the fifth one is v'sha'ovra shnosa. If it was, let's say, a lamb and went over an entire year, that chatos is also left to die. V'nokat Shmuel gabe Pesach simonabe. Shmuel then tells us a klal, a principle, a way of remembering what will be also the case in regards to a korban Pesach. V'omar, he says, kol shebechatas mesa. If the chatas, one of these chatas is mesa, in any of these scenarios, imisro hachi bepesach korev shlomim. If any of these things happen to the korban Pesach, then in regards to the korban Pesach, we'll have a reminder what you do with such a case. In that case, you would bring it up as a korban shlomim, as a korban Pesach. So again, all of these cases in the korban chatas that are left to die, in the same scenarios, if they would be a korban Pesach, they would be brought up as a korban shlomim. Rashi goes on to say, "V'kosal gedaitoch da'akulu meisos deratos de'eshkochen gabi Pesach korban shlomim dahainu tmuras Pesach uPesach shemeisu bailov v'shekipru bailov v'sheovro shenosen krev v'shlomim." And the havamin over here now is that all of these things apply to a korban Pesach. Says Shmuel again, just to repeat the first words and we'll go on. Kol shebechatos meso. All of these scenarios where the chatas is left to die, then the Pesach korev shlomim will know that if it happens to a korban Pesach, not that there's a corollary necessarily, but as a reminder, as a way of remembering what is the din by korban Pesach, they will be brought as a korban shlomim. The kol, says Shmuel further, the kol shebechatas roya bepesach nami roya, and all the chatos that are left to graze and then gain a mum, to then be sold and then use their money for the korban sibur of a korban oila, that will also be the case when it comes to the korban Pesach. Rabbi Yochanan said, "Ein ha-Pesach korev shlomim ela shenimtza achar shchita, aval kodem shchita loy." Rabbi Yochanan says, all of the Pesach that is brought as a korban shlomim, it's only if it is found after the korban, it's lost, the animal was lost and was found after the korban was shechted. But if it was found before the korban shechted, then not. It won't be a korban shlomim, but rather it would be then left to graze. The Gemara explained the case of Rabbi Yochanan. Now the Gemara asks a challenge, a question on Shmuel's principle when he said at the latter part that the same way that when a korban chatas will then have to graze, in those scenarios that a korban Pesach will have to graze. Maskif lo Rav Yosef, v'klolahu. Rav Yosef, is this a klal that you're saying? Harei chato she'ovra shnoso dileriya azlo. A chatas that goes over a year, so then it will go and graze. The Omer of Shimon ben Lakish, chatas she'ovra shnosa roin oisa ki ilu hi oimedes bebeis hakvaros veroya. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says that if you have a chatas that goes over a year, then it's as if it's standing in the Beis HaKvaros. That means a kohen is prohibited from going to the Beis HaKvaros. He cannot take the chatas and slaughter it. Rather, it's left to graze. V'ilu ba'Pesach ki agavna korv shlomim. But in that scenario, where it goes over a year, let's say you have a lamb that you designate as a korban Pesach, and then since the korban Pesach can only be up to a year, if it goes beyond that year, is brought as a korban shlomim. So here we see that which is going to be a grazing for a korban chatas is not like Shmuel says should be a grazing for a korban Pesach, but rather here we see that the korban Pesach will have to then be brought up as a korban shlomim, the Tanya, and let's prove that indeed if it's over a year old, that korban Pesach becomes a korban shlomim, the Tanya. Kesev, the Brisa brings a pasuk kesev which we saw before on Amud Beis. L'Rabbi says Pesach la'aliyah. This comes to include the fact that the aliyah of a korban Pesach is brought on the mizbeach. Kishehu oimer im kesev, that which supposedly adds the word im kesev, which seems to be superfluous, is l'rabois es ha-pesach she'over shenosoi, to include a korban Pesach that goes beyond 1 year. V'shlomim haboim machmas Pesach, and a shlom that would be coming machmas Pesach. For example, if you have a scenario where you have a korban shlomim that is brought because of a korban Pesach, like we said, an animal was lost, and then somebody then designated another korban Pesach. He ultimately found the original korban Pesach only after the second one that was designated was slaughtered. So all of these are korban shlomim. They call mitzvah shlomim. And in what way are they like shlomim? Shetu'unin smicha, they require smicha, v'nesachim, wine libations, v'tnufas hachazeh v'shoik, they have to be waved. Kishu oimer im eis, the Brisa continues and says, im eis, what does it come to add? Hare, all of the psukim before that we're talking about a keves is equally applicable to an eis. They're both korban shlomim. What's then the additional psukim that talk about an eis? Hifsika inyan limeid ala eish ein ton aliyah. Come to teach us a chiddush that although the keves or the kesev that the Torah calls it, which is interchangeable, which the aliyah is brought on the mizbeach for Korban Pesach, the eiz, if it was be a Korban Pesach, would not be brought the aliyah. That's the distinction between the two. Or marlei. So al kapani, we're left with the brisa that said that if you have a korban Pesach that goes beyond 1 year, is brought as a korban shlomim, which then again is counter to what Shmuel said. Because again, Shmuel said that korban chatas is beyond a year is left to graze, whereby a korban Pesach also then would be left to graze. Yet we see in the Brisa that if it's over 1 year old, a korban Pesach is brought as a korban shlomim. Gemara says, Amar le ki ka'amar Shmuel ba'avudin. Shmuel was talking about those korbanos that were lost and then ultimately found. B'dechuyin loy omar. He wasn't talking about b'dechuyin. And therefore there's not a kasha on him because when it goes over a year it's called dechuyin. That's not what Shmuel was referring to. He was talking about a scenario where the korban was lost and then he designated another one, then it was found again. Ve'ovud mi mishkachas. Ask the Gemara, in the case where it was lost, how would we find such a scenario that he's talking about? Because, behold, the case where it was lost, the Rabbanan said if you were mafrish it, the time that it was mafrish, that would then be left out to graze. If you separated a korban chatos and then it got lost after separating it, and then you separate another one in its place for a new chatos, since you lost the original chatos, and then you subsequently found the original chatos. Rebbe says the first one is indeed brought as a korban, while the second one is left to die. Whereas the Chacham say, though, you will not let it die, but rather you will leave it until after the Bailim get a kapara. Meaning what? Diuk hakoydem sheniskapru bailim roya. But before the bailim have a kapara, then it will be left out to graze. So we don't have a scenario where it's lost and it would be left to die, according to the Chachamim. Vilu Pesach heiche da ovad v'nimtza achar chatzois kodem shchita karv shlomim. Whereas in the case of the Korban Pesach, so therefore, according to the Chachamim, rather, in that scenario where it was lost after it was your mafrish, so then it would be left if you found it. So it says that you found it before the kapara of the bailim, it would be left to graze. So that's in the case of the chatos. So now you have a case where the chatos is grazing. Now, according to Shmuel, it would mean that the Korban Pesach would also then graze. And yet, the Gemara says, Vilu Pesach, heiche da'ova v'nimtza achar chatzois, kodem shchita, karv shlomim. But if you would find that Korban Pesach after chatzois, this is like the shita that Rabbi Zera spoke out before, that if it's found after chatzois, then you would bring it as a Korban shlomim. So again, it will be a kasha on Shmuel. The Gemara answers, Shmuel kerebi svirle. Shmuel does not go like the Chacham, he goes like Rebbe. Who says that we just quoted before that it would go to Misa, would be left to die. Ask the Gemara, are you going to say all that was lost according to Rebbe would die? The Gemara says, by Pesach, where it was then lost before Chatzois, and then you found it before Chatzois, it would be left to get graze. So you see that Rabbi would not say that it would go ahead and die. Says the Gemara, Koidem Chatzois, lav avurhu. That's not a kasha because Koidem Chatzois is not considered to be an Aveda. It's not considered to be lost, since it wasn't at a time where it could be designated as a Korban Pesach. It's not after Chatzois, so therefore it's not considered to be lost either. Whereby when you find it, then that which is going to be found is not considered to be an Aveda. Because the Rava, like Rava says, the Omar Rava Avedas Laila. If you have a Chatos that got lost at night, Lav Shma Aveda. It's not called an Aveda. It is not considered to be an Aveda. So then, so too over here, if something that's koydem chatzois, so therefore it's not considered to be an aveda. So it's not going to be a kasha on Shmuel. Elo rather roya leRebbe hechi mishkachaslo. So the Gemara asked, but we're going to have a case of where it's roya according to Rebbe. Granted, we found the case before where it's mesa, but where is it in the case of roya? Asks the Gemara. We're on top of Tzadik Zayin Amud Beis. Gemara says, Kid Rebbe Oshaya, Domer Rebbe Oshaya. A person, he separates two chatois. He's concerned that maybe one will get lost. So therefore, he separates two to then ensure that he will then certainly bring his chatos. So it says, Miskapir ba'achas mehen, v'shniya teroya. The one will then be a kapara, a chatos, whereas the other one he'll be left to graze. And over here, it's not a case where it was lost. Because over here, initially, he separated it, and therefore never was nidche, rather. He was never nidche, so that would then be considered a chatas as dachui, because initially he separated the two to be a carbon chatos, in case one of them gets lost. So over here, none of them got lost, and therefore there's never a situation where it was nidche. So that's why over here, you can bring one as the kapara, whereas the other one will be left to graze. I asked the Gemara could have asked right now, by the way, the Gemara could ask, as Rashi points out, that here's not a case where it's lost. But the Gemara chooses to ask another question. Ilu b'Pesach ki hai gavna karev shlomim. By Pesach, in this case, you would bring a shlomim. And again, Shmuel says, by a chatas that you would let graze, then by a Korban Pesach would also let to graze. Whereas over here, we're saying that's not true. According to over here, we're saying that if it was a Korban Pesach, then indeed it would be brought as a Korban Shlomim. The Gemara says, Ella rather Shmuel Rabbi Shimon Svirole. Shmuel really ascribes the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. The Omar, who said, Chamesh Chatois Mesois. He is of the opinion that in all scenarios, they would die. Ask the Gemara, V'ho Roya Rabbi Shimon Les Leiklal. The Rabbi Shimon says, according to Rabbi Shimon, they were all died. There would not be a case of roya, and still we have two statements that Shmuel said. If he goes like Rabbi Shimon, he has first statement that if the korban chatos is going to then be left to die, then the korban Pesach will then be brought as a korban shlomim. The second scenario that he brought was if you have a korban chatos that is left to graze, the korban Pesach is left to graze. So over here, you never have a scenario where it's left to graze. According to Rabbi Shimon, it's always going to be dying. Gemara answers, Shmuel nami chade ka'omar. Shmuel did not say both statements. He said, Kol shebechatas meisa pesach karev shlomim. He said only the first of the two statements. Shmuel said that when the korban chatos is left to die, then the korban Pesach is brought as a korban shlomim. Aval koidem shchita, so that's the scenario. He didn't speak out the second scenario that we thought he spoke out. And therefore it was incorrectly ascribed to Shmuel's words. Shmuel only said one statement only. Again, that if the korban chatos is left to die, the korban Pesach is then going to be brought as a korban shlomim. But he did not bring the second statement that we thought he brought, that if the korban chatos is going to be grazing, then the korban Pesach will also be going to graze. He didn't say that. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, my kamash malon, what is he then coming to teach us more than we already know from the Mishnah? The Mishnah states that if you're going to then have an animal that was brought as a korban Pesach and was lost, and then there was found again after Chatzois, so then there we said that you would bring that korban, was originally a korban Pesach, to be now a korban shlomim. So what is Shmuel come to Mahad Chadesh? If it's before Chatzois, it's not an Aveda. If it's after Chatzois, the Mishnah already states that din. Answers the Gemara, La'apuke mit Rabbi Yochanan. Shmuel comes to exclude, to be moitzi from the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. The Omar who said, which was quoted on Amud Aleph, Ein ha-Pesach korev shlomim, ela shenimtza acha shchita, aval koidem shchita loy. That Rabbi Yochanan said, when is it that the korban Pesach is nikrav as a korban shlomim? That's if you find it after the korban Pesach was already, the second korban Pesach that you designated was already nishchat. Then that original korban Pesach that you had lost and now found can be brought as a korban shlomim. But if it was found before the shchita of the second designated korban Pesach, then not. Alma, shchita kova. Obviously, according to Rabbi Yochanan, he goes like the shita of Rabbah, that the shchita is what's koveya. That's only if you find it again after the shchita do we say that you can bring the korban Pesach as a shlomim. Kamash malan chatzois kova. Over here, Shmuel is ascribing to say that it's chatzois that is koveya, and therefore, so long as it's after chatzois, even if it's before the shchita, still you can go ahead and makriv this korban Pesach as a korban shlomim.